In this class, we teach you a lot of technical subjects, but I also want to teach you a little bit about some of the societal implications of data science. The digital age is changing the nature of privacy, and it affects all of us. And I think if you're going to be a data scientist, you ought to learn a little bit about privacy, because you might just have to deal with it in your future career. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a primer, a brief overview, and introduction to privacy. A helpful place to start is to look at some examples of privacy and technology companies. And Facebook is an interesting example. If you've been following the news, earlier this year you might have seen headlines about Facebook and privacy. It was a big deal. Mark Zuckerberg went to testify in Congress. It was all over the news. So what happened? What happened was a company called Cambridge Analytica ended up getting access to information about the private profiles of 87 million Facebook users without the permission of those Facebook users. And this got some attention because Cambridge Analytica was a little bit controversial company that had previously been in the news. They were involved with political campaigning, get out the vote for particular candidates. And these 87 million Facebook users had never approved allowing their data to gain access, to be given to Cambridge Analytica. So they were pretty upset. So how did it happen that this company ended up with data about 87 million Facebook users? Well, it's a little bit of a story. See, it started with an academic researcher who made a Facebook application available, let people take a survey to learn about their personality, and invited people to take the survey and help academic research. And close to 300,000 people did. They found it fun, and they took the survey, and they were glad to allow their data to be used for research. What many of them might not have realized was that this application was gathering not only the responses to the survey questions, but information about their profile and information about the profiles of all of their friends, whether they knew it or not, whether their friends knew it or not. Then Cambridge Analytica bought this data from the academic researcher and maybe started using it for some of their political campaigns. It's not clear whether they actually ended up using the data, whether it was useful to them, but they had bragged about their ability to do so. And so that got a lot of attention. So it was particularly noteworthy because most of those 87 million people had never approved allowing the researcher to gain access to their data, let alone Cambridge Analytica to gain access to their data. It wasn't something they were aware of or given permission to. So it happened in this pretty indirect way, and it's a good example of how people can feel like their trust has been violated if their information is not handled in accordance with their wishes. It's actually pretty interesting to look at what inferences can be drawn from the kind of data that Facebook has about you. And another scientific research study found that just knowing what things you clicked like on is enough to predict a surprising amount of information about you, things you might not have thought of. One thing that can be inferred about you, if you're in the US, is what your political leaning is. So for US voters, whether you lean Republican or whether you lean Democrat, which way you're likely to vote in the next election. Not perfectly, but that can be predicted with 85% accuracy. And if you think about it for a moment, maybe that's not too surprising. Like if you ended up liking some news articles that were maybe on a more Democratic-leaning news site, then maybe that's an indicator you're more likely to vote Democratic in the next election. If you're liking some articles on a Republican site, then maybe that's an indicator that you're more likely to vote Republican. And you can probably think of how different sources we read might be correlated with whether you're more likely to be Democratic or Republican. So the researchers were able to build a machine learning classifier that, given the likes, was able to predict political orientation with pretty good accuracy. That's not too surprising, but maybe what's more surprising, some of the other things that can be predicted about you. For instance, they could predict race with 95% accuracy. They could predict religion with reasonable accuracy. They could predict sexual orientation with reasonable accuracy. A bunch of things. One of the reasons why I called out religion, for instance, is that here in the U.S. in the past, a few years back, there were some proposals that maybe we should have a registry of all Muslims in the U.S., a pretty controversial proposal, to say the least. And I thought it's interesting, regardless of what you may think about that proposal, to know what might be possible with the data that companies already have about Americans. In other words, it wouldn't even require a registry or collecting data or requiring people to sign up. Just the information that Facebook already has about people would be enough to do a pretty good job of identifying the religion of a lot of Americans. Okay, so these are some examples of inferences that can be drawn that might surprise you. I bet a lot of people on Facebook might not realize just what can be inferred or predicted about them from the information that Facebook has. Here's another interesting experiment that Facebook did that I think tells us something about how information about people can be used to influence their behavior. So Facebook did an experiment a couple of years back in a U.S. election where they send a get out the vote message to a bunch of people on Facebook. They showed them a message that said, hey, it's election day. You should go vote. It'd be a good idea. I encourage you to go vote. But actually they had two different messages. Half the people saw the first message, which was the you should go vote. It's a good idea. It's election day. Don't forget. The other half saw that same message with a slight addition. Facebook also showed them thumbnail images of some of their friends who'd already voted and said, hey, look, your friends have already voted. You should go vote too. And what they discovered was that the second message was significantly more effective. It had an effect showing people that their friends had voted. Over 300,000 more people voted when they saw the second message. Okay, so what this illustrates is that Facebook was able to influence behavior in a fairly significant way. Now, it was a totally benign experiment. They had good intentions, but some folks who are worried about the implications of privacy point out what the potential here is if we imagine a what-if scenario. What if, for some reason in the future, Facebook was nefarious and they wanted to influence the outcome of an election? They had a particular candidate they wanted to see elected. Well, now you could start to imagine scenarios where they infer who's likely to vote for that candidate using the techniques I previously mentioned. And then for the people who they think are likely to vote for their preferred candidate, they send them messaging, really effective messaging, encouraging them to go vote. And for others, they send them less effective messaging or no messaging at all. Okay, so what this illustrates is that information about us could be used to influence our behavior. And while it's a pretty extreme scenario that probably doesn't seem very likely at the moment, it's an example to get you thinking about how some of the potential implications of the data that's available and how it might be used to influence people. There's another nice example that I thought I'd mention that's worth knowing about, which was from Netflix. Netflix had a public challenge to researchers to improve their recommendation system. If you've ever watched movies on Netflix, you know that if you rate some movies, Netflix will suggest to you some other movies you might like. Well, Netflix issued a public challenge to independent researchers saying, hey, can you improve on our recommendations? Can you come up with any way to give people better movie recommendations? And to support that, they released a data set of how millions of their users had rated a whole bunch of movies. And their challenge was, hey, researchers, what can you do with this data set? They even offered a $1 million prize for the best solution. Now, of course, the way that people rate movies is potentially private. People probably aren't expecting that to become public. So to protect people's privacy, what Netflix did was they anonymized this data set. They replaced people's names with anonymous identifier. So instead of the data set saying John Smith rated Princess Bride 5 stars, instead it said user 27 rated Princess Bride 5 stars. Okay, sounds like a pretty good way to protect privacy, you might think, at least on the surface. But what some privacy researchers discovered was that actually it's possible to de-anonymize the data set and recover the identity of people in the data set. They discovered that if they knew 2 movies you'd rated, what ratings you gave and when you rated them, then that was enough to uniquely identify you in the data set and figure out what ratings you'd given to other movies. So if they knew that you'd given The Princess Bride 5 stars on January 2nd and you'd watched The Matrix and rated it 1 star on January 5th, that alone was enough to identify you. And they could say, oh, hey, that's user 37, and here's all the other movies that you rated and what you rated them. Okay? Not always, but maybe 2/3 of the time. All right, so this is an eye-opening experience for many people in the privacy world because it showed people the difficulty of anonymizing data sets. They're harder to anonymize, you might think. And there's been a series of further examples like this where medical data sets and other data sets that were anonymized have been discovered. It's possible to recover the identity of the people and de-anonymize the data set. So this was a real lesson for companies and people who have data sets that, hey, it's pretty tricky to anonymize data and we have to be pretty careful about how we protect people's data, especially if we're going to be releasing it publicly. All right, so those are some examples that maybe are worth knowing about. They're interesting and they teach us some lessons. And 3 themes I wanted to get at here for how companies might come to learn information about your disclosure, collection, and inference. Disclosure is pretty obvious. It's like when I go to Amazon and I enter in my shipping address so they can send me the book I ordered, I'm disclosing to Amazon my home address. So Amazon now learns where I live. Collection's a little different. Collection is when I'm doing some activity and a company's collecting information about me, maybe without my awareness. For instance, if I'm going to a web page, the website I'm going to collects information that I visited there. This can get kind of subtle. If I go to a web page on the New York Times and I read a newspaper article and I click the like button there, then Facebook learns that I visited that web page, was reading that article, and I liked it. And that's probably pretty obvious. But what might not be obvious is if I'm going to that web page to read a newspaper article on the New York Times website and there's a like button on the page and I don't click the like button, then Facebook still learns that I visited that page because they're collecting information every time you visit a page that has a like button on it. And the same thing happens with advertising. It happens with search. If I go to Google and enter search term and I click on one of the search results, Google collects which result I clicked on. When I go to a web page with advertising on it, the advertiser collects information that I visited that page. Maybe it helps them show better ads in the future. So that's collection. And then inference is perhaps even more subtle. It's like this example that I mentioned earlier about how what's possible to infer about you from your Facebook likes. Given the information you've disclosed or that's been collected about you, sometimes it's possible to draw inferences, make predictions about you, infer other characteristics about you that were not in the data set, but that we can infer. And so this has some implications for privacy. Disclosure usually is pretty evident to people. They're aware that they're disclosing the information. Presumably they have the option to not provide it. So disclosure has the least privacy implications. A collection potentially has more privacy implications because people may not be aware that the information is being collected about them, let alone how it's going to be used. And inference potentially has the most sensitive privacy implications because it may be very hard for people to anticipate what inferences can be drawn about them. They might be very surprised and really actually have concerns about how their data is being used. Okay, so those are some themes about privacy. At this point, you might be wondering, what is privacy? What do we mean by the word privacy? And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next video.